Welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast, the nature-based show hosted by me, Jack Perks. Each week I'm joined by a guest from the world of wildlife television, art and science. We take a light-hearted look into what makes these people tick and connect with the natural world so strongly, with new episodes out every Tuesday. Hello, Jack is back. And not only am I back, I'm in Belgium, of all places. What are you doing in Belgium, Jack? Well, I'm glad you asked. I am here looking for the only member of the cod family to live in fresh water, and that's the Burbot lotta lotta. Now, you might not have heard a lotta, see what I did there? You might not have heard a lot of this fish before, but we did have them in the UK. Unfortunately, we don't anymore, and that's why I've come to Belgium, because they have a reintroduction programme. Later on in the podcast, I'm going to talk to one of the people who works here, organises all the reintroductions, and why theirs has been a success. I'm also going to be talking to several other Burbot experts. We're going to get proper nerdy in this one, talking all about this weird, and in my opinion, beautiful looking fish. Stay tuned. Now, my first guest is Johan Ulrichs. Apologies for butchering your surname, Johan. Now, he very kindly invited me out to go and see the breeding programme and some Burbot, which was absolutely incredible. I drove over to Brussels, stayed there for a couple of nights, and was amazing to see these fish in the flesh. I also made a short film, which is basically a distilled version of this podcast, and there's a link to that in the description also. Now, Johan has been trying to reintroduce Burbot into Belgium. So far, they've released quite a few, and Belgium is basically a big version of Norfolk. It's flat, there's farmland, the rivers are slow moving. It's a perfect match, including the climate, which is very similar. So if Burbot can be successful in Belgium, there's no reason why we couldn't have them in the UK. So here's our chat.
Hi, my name is Johan Ulrichs. I work for the Institute for Nature and Forest Conservation in Belgium. And for the moment we are in Linkebeek, the fish farm of Linkebeek, where we have the Burbot.
Lots of Burbot.
Lots of Burbot. I think at the moment we have about 1.5 million. Of course.
Wow.
Of course, these are tiny, small larvae, but we have a lot of them.
And we're currently stood by the pond where the big ones are, aren't we?
Yeah. So we have a special pond for the broodstock of Burbot, very protected, where there's a lot of natural food inside the pond, because Burbot, they like to eat small fish. And yeah, we have to provide plenty of small fish to have them in a good condition.
Yeah, nice and hungry. So obviously the UK we don't have Burbot anymore, but here in Belgium you've successfully reintroduced them. Well, you can tell me more, but like, what do you think was the reason for the success of Burbot in Belgium, or is it too early days for that?
It's a bit early days.
Okay.
We have now a natural reproduction of our released Burbot, and that's of course a very important step, so that the circle is closed.
Yeah.
So you release young of the year Burbots in a river, you see them growing, you see them surviving, finally you have a wild broodstock somewhere, and you see them reproducing, and you see the year after once again juveniles. So it's very nice to have this circle closed, but still it's a very low density, and we don't know yet if it's a self-sustaining population.
Right. So how easy are they to captive breed then?
Once you know the technique, it's not that difficult.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it's quite easy. Once you know it, everything is easy. A good Belgian beer cooler, you can breed Burbot.
That's the key to success.
That's the key to success.
Because I suppose Belgium is similar, I guess, to lots of places where Burbot were in the UK, like in Norfolk and areas like that were kind of flat and slow-moving rivers and whatnot, and that's where they're found in Belgium, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I think you can compare those areas.
Yeah.
That's no problem.
And why are Burbot important to the wider environment? Because I guess a lot of people go, well, why bother? Why bother reintroducing Burbot? So why should we do it?
Well, you have a couple of top predatory fish in the rivers. Pike is the typical top predator from stagnated waters. Brown trout is the predator from fast-running rivers. And Burbot is in between. It's a typical top predator of the lowland rivers. And you need the top predator to have a good ecosystem. Burbot is known to eat a lot of exotic species, so it's nice to have this fish that it controls the exotic species like topmouth gudgeon or
Signal crayfish?
also someone published something on.
I know
this.
you get. I don't think we've got them in the UK, but you get invasive freshwater blennies here, don't you?
Yeah,
And the burbot eat those, don't they?
they also like
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they eat almost everything. So if you have some exotic species that's quite dominant, you can control it by burbot. So you need this fish in the UK.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Just add that in, Johan. That's great.
That was Johan. Amazing guy. Thank you so much for letting me go out there and see those incredible fish. Well, my next guest is Ian Welby, and he is a fisheries scientist. And Ian has got history with the burbot because around 2006-2007, he was part of a feasibility team to see if burbot could be introduced to the UK. Is our water good enough? Is our climate good enough? And Ian was studying this. Now, I met Ian, this is about 15 years ago now, because I was applying to go on that course. Life had other plans for me and I ended up filming fish instead of studying them. But it brought us back together because of our interest in burbot. So I went down to Ian's house. He only lives 20 minutes from me. We sat in his conservatory on a rainy March day and had a good old waffle about burbot and if they could indeed live in the UK now. So welcome to the podcast, Ian.
Thank you, Jack. Nice to be here.
Yeah,
Good to talk about burbot.
Exactly. Who wouldn't want to talk about burbot? And we are currently sat in your conservatory on a rainy March day. Perfect for burbot, I suppose. Nice and
Yeah.
nice and wet. So, well, let's start with it. So, you were part of the team that tried to study the feasibility of burbot reintroduction. I think it was before 2007. I met you in 2007. didn't I?
Yes. I think we took 2005. I think we started it all off. It really all started with a chap called Keith Easton, who
Yeah.
I know you know, fantastic fisheries biologist, and he came to one of our one-day seminars that we held at Brooksby, gave a talk about burbot, and allayed some of the myths that I'd always bought into, particularly they have to spawn under ice and it's too warm in the UK now.
Yeah.
And Keith, being Keith, just put those myths to bed, and it really was a light bulb moment to me. Yeah, people have always said this. I hadn't questioned it, and actually, when you question it, they went extinct during one of the coldest few decades on history in the UK. There was ice all the way along the River Great Ouse through the 50s and 60s, and people were skating on the Thames again in Oxford.
I suppose enough people write it in a book over the years. You just don't question it.
Yeah. It's not wishing to speak of the dead, ill of the dead, but a black called Alan Wheeler was largely responsible because he put it in his textbook of fish, and that became gold standard textbook. And I don't think he meant it particularly. It was just that was the received wisdom at the time.
Yeah.
And they'd been in decline for probably half a century before they went extinct. They were never particularly important species for anybody. Nobody particularly loved them for any particular reason. They weren't favoured in the UK or anything. So they were allowed to quietly go extinct, and that was the rumour that was part of it. So that inspired me, and I thought they were a good hook, excuse the pun, for something I firmly believe in, which is that we should be much more interested in fish.
Yeah, definitely.
For in of themselves, rather than fisheries or anglers or the aquatic environment. Fish are a mainstay of our environment. They're really important in a whole variety of bits of ecology.
Well, I suppose the interesting thing with burbot is that we lost them in living memory. There'll be people
Absolutely.
sat in their care homes right now who may very well have caught a burbot. It's not like beavers or lynx, which were gone hundreds of years ago. This is an animal we've lost in a generation.
Absolutely. It really surprised me how many of my students at the time, because I was working at Brooksby, who lived down around the area, would say, my grandpa used to catch them on the Trent all the time. They were, and that was another surprise, another thing. I always had assumed that they were relatively uncommon, that they weren't a particularly common species and therefore not particularly important, and that's one of the reasons they were allowed. And that was very wrong as well. They were common.
Wow.
They were plentiful. They were a big part of the ecology of a whole variety of rivers. And when you go back through the history books, and I've got quite a lot of old textbooks on fish, back to sort of the 1600s. Burbot are mentioned as a normal part of the ecology. They're not special. They're not taken.
It's just like roach, perch, burbot.
Yeah.
You know.
And so they were quite common. They were restricted in their presence. They were only on the East Coast rivers.
So am I right in thinking, is it as far north as South Yorkshire, or any further than about that?
Yeah. The Yorkshire Ouse, the Derwent, a few of those rivers. Yeah.
And then down to, I think, they weren't in the Thames catchment, were they? So
no,
they
don't appear to have been in the Thames. So
kind
but
of
everything above the Thames catchment, essentially.
Right. Okay. So relatively limited then, isn't it? I guess.
Yeah. But that's a common limitation, if you like, for British freshwater fish.
Yeah.
And some of them East Coast rivers,
silver bream and things like that.
And some of them we've obviously spread them to barbel, much more common now than they used to be because people have moved them around.
We like to catch them.
We like to catch them. People think they're important, so people move them about.
Yeah.
So they're widespread in the Severn, but I think they were introduced into the Severn, for example.
And of course, we met through that because when you would. So what was your role on the course? Were you the head lecturer or just?
You were a course tutor.
You were a course tutor because So when I was 16, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I applied for that course, and then I'd never seen a zander or an eel before, so that was amazing. I think you kind of said, "Oh, look in this tub," and you pulled out this female. I think it was a female burbot, and I vividly remember the water dripping off its beard, and it had all this kind of patterning and sprats of yellow. And at the time, I didn't think it was significant. Obviously, in the years since, I was like, Jesus, I must be one of the...
Actually seen one of them?
Well, yeah, I'm one of the few British people that's seen a burbot in Britain. There can't be many people that said that. And obviously, my life went another way, and I ended up fiddling around with cameras, which I quite like. But that was a while ago. But for lack of a better terminology, then, what went wrong with the feasibility when we had all these burbot in the UK? Because I think a lot of people think that you were trying to reintroduce them, but that wasn't quite what you were doing.
No. We set up a group. I got enthusiastic. Keith obviously has always been enthusiastic. Was a lifelong project of his to look at feasibility of reintroducing burbot, and that was the purpose of our project. So main strand for Brooksby was to show that we could artificially spawn them, hatch eggs and get the eggs to first feed under temperature regimes current in the UK.
Okay. So
what we did was we installed them in a shack on Brooksby's ground. It was all temperature controlled, so we had big air chillers to keep the water cold and an air conditioning unit on it. And we set that against the Trent. So if it was 5 degrees in the Trent any one day, our water was 5 degrees. And then come February, we artificially spawned them. We hatched probably a couple of thousand eggs, and probably took a couple of hundred of those hatchlings through to first feed.
So in theory, if those burbot were in the Trent, they would have spawned.
Yeah. So it was essentially a very finger in the air way of showing that the temperature regimes in the UK weren't what sent the burbot extinct.
No,
it wasn't anything to do with the temperature. During the time they went extinct, salmon went extinct on the East Coast rivers. Trout pretty much went extinct. This is the period of time when you could tell what was going on the Trent by how badly it was steaming in any one day, because there was a lot of rubbish going into it. So it's not surprising, given the condition of the rivers during that sort of century, that these things went extinct, because a lot of other species went extinct from those rivers, but they could recolonise from other parts of the UK.
And burbot can't.
So that was our purpose, and I think we were reasonably successful with it. We, as part of the import, we had to promise to do various things, which we did, and the fish were never to be reintroduced. That was never the plan, even the offspring. That was never the plan. It was part of the...
Just a feasibility study, really.
Just a feasibility study. And we're quite happy with that. There's no... we were all biologists, so we are still all biologists, and we understand the risks of willfully dumb reintroductions. There's nothing worse, in fact, than a stupid reintroduction. We wanted to make sure that a reintroduction was right for the conditions, that the fish species was likely to thrive and all the rest of it, and also that there was no risk of us bringing in any other invasive non-native species, and that we were bringing the right burbot back. That was also very important.
I didn't realise how variable they were. So talking to the guys in Belgium, they were saying they're a bit like brown trout in that there's so many different niches and types and whatnot. And again, people just call them all. I think there's an argument that some of them may be subspecies or even.
There's always arguments about that.
Yeah, of course.
Essentially, they're all the same species.
Yeah.
But they have a holy Arctic, they call it, all the way around the top of the planet.
Yeah.
You'll find them. So North America, Canada, Alaska, Siberia, all those sort of areas, you will find burbot. Because they've been geographically isolated for millennia, there are differences between a burbot you'll find in Finland and a burbot you'll find in Canada, fairly obviously.
Yeah.
But they're the same species. If you got them together, they would get on fine. What is one way of putting it?
Yeah.
But if we wanted to reintroduce the fish into the UK, we wanted to be certain that they were as genetically similar to the ones we've lost.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So part of the project was a chap called Dr. Worthington looked at the genetics of our lost species and the genetics of the distribution. So he went round all the old Natural History Museum and various.
There's one in
old
Wooderton,
museums.
isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Yeah. And fin clipped them. Just took a little fin clip off the dried out animal, because they're taxidermied animals, and did genetics on them. So he discovered that the various they call them glades, these subspecies but they're glades. They're just genetically different, and our genetic forebears actually are more Finnish than Denmark, and strangely the European has 2 or 3 glades,
right,
and they're quite close to each other. So that was an important part of the project, and the other part, this was all done at Portsmouth University, was Southampton University, was looking at the feasibility. So looking at where you found them commonly in places like Denmark and Finland and Germany, and typing that against what we have currently in the UK.
Yeah.
So are the conditions that they're found on the continent available in the UK?
That makes
and again, that was fairly conclusive that yes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the project at the end showed, yes, that we could produce viable offspring in the temperature regimes in the UK. We could find genetically similar, if not identical, species to reintroduce, and that reintroduction habitat was available throughout the catchment. So, and that's where that was the end of our project. That was what our project. And people seem to think it petered out and failed. Actually, the projects as we set them out were 100% successful.
Yeah, it's just no one picked it up. So one of the things that a lot of people have been messaging when I've been posting pictures of burbot is about the state of rivers now, because obviously, raw sewage pumping into them and all that sort of stuff, and water quality. How would that affect burbot? Like, are our rivers still clean enough for burbot to go in, or is that an unknown quantity?
My personal view is that whilst it's terrible and it is part of the duty of the water companies to treat the sewage before they put it in, which they start, actually, if you look at what the rivers were like in the 40s and 50s, where the trend is light years in front of what it was in that time, and is clean for fish. We have a problem with how we treat our water courses, and sewage treatment is one of those. Water resources, the amount of water we abstract is probably a bigger issue. But certainly they haven't changed since the feasibility in 2007, 2008 when it was published, which showed that the water courses that were studied were good enough. Contained other species that would, like brown trout. We still have plenty of brown trout. Brown trout are probably slightly more sensitive than burbot.
So a good indicator is if you've got brown trout, there's a good chance burbot would probably be fine in there. So it's a case that obviously water quality could do with being better, but it is sufficient for burbot at the minute. And if you compare it to the 40s, it is better than what was essentially.
Absolutely. And perhaps that's one of the things that we can do with any proposed reintroduction of burbot is have a clean river fund for it and give that as this is the iconic species that we want to protect, and that's why we need to spend a bit more money on sewage treatment and stuff. It's a very complicated issue, the whole issue of rivers.
I suppose also whenever you're trying to reintroduce a top predator, people always get a little bit finicky as well.
I suspect that would be one of the big complaints is, there's enough predators in the out, but it's not a...
Often those same people don't moan about Xander though.
They don't. Well, some people moan about Xander.
Some do, but
and some people moan about pike. As with all things, we couldn't keep everybody happy with a reintroduction like the burbot, and I suppose yes, it's very difficult under those circumstances because people don't like the reintroduction of the otter. Well, actually, it wasn't a reintroduction. They
never
recolonised from other parts of the UK.
Yeah.
It's a myth that the reintroduction, there were two sets of, and they're a perfect example of why I don't particularly like reintroduction programs, because they don't work. And the otter's a perfect example. The reintroduction programs were done by fools who didn't know what they were doing, producing hand-reared animals that could never survive appropriately in the wild. And where they were reintroduced, there are problems. But the rest, where natural recolonisation from satellite sites that were still in Wales. I grew up in Devon, and we had otters on our trout farm, way back in the 80s, common. So the reintroduction failed, but we still got otters. They came back. If we were to reintroduce the burbot, we would start way down the line. There wouldn't be we would be seeding eggs, so that the fry had to survive the whole thing, rather than seeding adults, which are bred to be in a tank sort of thing.
Because they're not going to know how to survive.
You essentially have to train your animal not to think it's anything other than a wild animal.
Yeah. Which makes sense, and I think you've already covered a couple of these already, but let's dispel some burbot myths.
Yeah.
Because I've never known a fish with so much misinformation than the bloody burbot. So you touched on it at the beginning, but ice spawning. So burbot don't need to spawn. They can spawn under ice, but they don't need to.
No, absolutely. It's an old joke which you have to work on to get is that they would be the only species that had to have a headache before it could spawn. Yes, it's an entire myth. They're complicated spawning rituals, and they have tiny little eggs. They are very, very small. Anybody who buys Mark Everard's book, there's a burbot egg on the front of that, and that is for a fish egg is very small, the same size as a cod egg. So, and they float. So the circle in the middle of that picture is an air hole. So they're slightly buoyant, so they tend to spawn at the top of catchments, and the eggs float down, preferably going out onto sort of floodplains where they hatch, and then hatching in the spring when there's lots of food available.
And so on the subject of floodplains then as well, so that's their preferred habitat, but not necessarily an absolute, like they can still spawn in the river, can they?
And they spawn very successfully in some lakes and some feeder streams to lakes and things.
Yeah,
they're quite a resilient species, surprisingly.
Well, ironically, really.
Except in the UK, they've survived everywhere else. And in fact thrive very well. But they are a cold water species, it's true. But the idea that they need to spawn under ice is obviously a myth. You know, that would put them out of every a number of years in every decade. They wouldn't be able to spawn because the ice doesn't form.
No, and that kind of brings on to the next point, is the temperature that they can handle, because a lot of people will talk about the summers in the UK, which as far as I'm aware isn't as big a problem as you'd think. We
worried about that a lot at Brooksby because they were inside a shed, and in the summer it got bloody hot. Apologies.
No, we can swear on this, don't worry. Bloody is very tame for this podcast.
And so we had beer chillers and various things, and the water temperatures got up to 26, 27, and they didn't like it, but they would survive fine.
Wow, I didn't know they got that warm.
And upper lethal limit temperature-wise is very important to fish. They don't like strange temperature regimes. But I think burbot would probably have a similar temperature tolerance to pike, for example, and pike do fine. I worry about pike fishing in the summer when people are handling them in the summer. I think that's probably a bad idea. Well, no, it's not probably a bad idea. It's a very bad idea. You will kill fish if you angle for pike when the water temperatures are over 21, 22. And the same would be true for burbot. But if you leave them alone and they can relax, chill out in their pool, deep down in the river with burbot in a small hole, and they just sit there, they'll ride it out, no problem.
So I guess that's the point. In the summer, if they're in a lake or in a river or whatever, they'll just go down deep.
Yeah. Lakes aren't really an issue because it's always cold at the bottom of the lake.
Yeah.
So they'll never have an issue on lakes, but in rivers, there'll still be areas where they can get on fine. And they're pretty, as we said, they're pretty resilient animals.
Yeah, and then that brings me on to the last burbot myth, which is the temperature the eggs can hatch. Because again, I've read all kinds of things online saying it's got to be 0 or it's got to be up to 4, and I think 4's the magic number, isn't it? Or round about there, 4 degrees.
Certainly, the literature suggests 4 is, but ours varied. Again, we hatched. They take a long time to hatch. There's a very small egg. It takes a long time to hatch because the water temperatures are so low. And I think some of the temperature varied between 4 and 7.
See, I mean, 7's quite achievable because a lot of people would say our winters aren't cold enough, but I mean, there's few winters where it doesn't get at least below 7.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So,
no, I think, as far as I'm concerned, we busted the myth that temperature was relevant to them.
Yeah.
They will survive in the temperature regimes present in the UK.
And breed.
Yeah, and breed.
Yeah.
And successfully. There's no temperature reason for them not setting up a sustainable population.
No. When I was over in Belgium, Johan was saying that if it can get up to 7, there might be a higher mortality rate in the eggs, but some will still hatch and make it. But I suppose that's the whole point why burbot have so many eggs. They're playing the numbers game.
Absolutely, yes. So it's common with fish, and of course that's nature and biology. Those surviving eggs, if they survive at a slightly higher temperature, they'll be the more resilient ones to a slightly higher temperature. When their parents go on, when they grow up and mature and have eggs, there will be slightly more higher percentage of eggs that can survive that.
Better adapted for a UK climate.
You do the adaptation game, and that's a perfect example. They may need to adapt a little bit, and we never gave the historic population a chance to do that adaptation because we were pouring chemicals into the rivers and chopping them up for navigation and putting barriers of migration because they're relatively migratory as well. They will move up and down catchments in the same way as all fish are migratory.
Yes, of course they are. Yeah,
Chub and barbel are migratory. They'll travel quite significant distances to spawning sites, and if you chop that river system up, don't allow them to, because they're not particularly strong swimmers. In that, you just have to look at their body shape. They're bottom-dwelling fish, and they like holes and sitting, but they're incredibly powerful. Well, we used to feed them live fish, the adults at Brooksby, and you drop a few live fish into the tanks, and you could hear them attacking them.
Really like piranhas.
Very aggressive, very powerful fish. Strike predators, amazing things.
Yeah, they really are.
They're very beautiful fish. I would like to stress they are stunning fish.
I really struggled.
Beautifully ugly.
Yeah, they are. No, that's a really good way of describing them because they only had juveniles for me to photograph in Belgium, but it's the adults that really take on that beautiful, like vivid yellows and like a mosaic of patterns. Good. So I wish I'd got some adults. Somewhere down the line, I'll have to photograph the adults because they are something else. They're really pretty. Yeah. They are very pretty. And we'll end on this last one. So a lot of people in the UK will likely have never heard of a burbot. So why should people care? Why should we bring them back?
They're the last vertebrate animal that went extinct in the UK. They're a big part of our history. If you go back through history books, you will find mention of burbot and how they were used and the role they've played over the centuries. And as such, surely that's worth something. But also, fish tend to get ignored. In fact, to a certain extent, some of the authorities seem to almost hate fish because fish are bad for biodiversity or bad for these sorts of things. Fish are part of biodiversity, really important link often between the aquatic environment and the terrestrial environment, because they get taken by otters and
if nothing else, they're protein.
And that's getting spread around the catchment. And they're a beautiful fish, they're a fascinating fish, and fish need something to highlight them. And if we're going to start talking about reintroducing wolves and things that went extinct centuries ago, why shouldn't we be talking about reintroducing a fish species that went in living memory? The last one was caught in 1969, so there were probably, that wasn't the last fish, obviously, that would have been a hell of a coincidence, so they were probably here in the 70s and slowly went extinct through that time as the population tends to dwindle past the point of no return. So it would be, it's a bit difficult to prove a negative, but I would throw the question back as why not?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we reintroduce this species, which went extinct in living memory? It was the last vertebrate animal in the UK to go extinct.
Yeah.
What did it say about us that we wouldn't do that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Ian. And obviously they would have been a key part of the food chain, both as a predator and prey. And taking any kind of cog out of the wheel is going to have an impact. And it's sort of, I forget is it shifting baseline syndrome, when you just get, because something's not been there so long, you get used to it. Yeah. So people are like, you're upsetting the natural balance. But what we have now is not the natural balance.
Absolutely, and some of the rivers we're talking about, which would potentially be a reintroduction site, do have quite a good natural, they're quite a good natural system, and restoring a cog into that system has got to be a thing worth trying, at least.
Exactly. I mean, look at our local River Trent. It's people. It has its issues. Don't get me wrong, but it's full of silver. It's not. Despite all the pressures and all the things that are thrown at it, in the grand scheme of things, it could be a lot worse. I'm not saying it's perfect, but
we have a problem with nature conservation, is that you always have to. Well, you're always looking for funding. You're always looking for people to give you money to do your nature conservation, and therefore you have to talk up, in some ways, the perilous state of this particular environment.
Doom and gloom.
And doom and gloom gets you money.
Yeah.
But of course you miss out the fact that we've moved on a lot in the last sort of 2 centuries from a state of the Thames being an open sewer with no life in it at all, to somewhere, certainly getting towards 200 different species can be found in the Thames through Greater London. And we forget sometimes to celebrate some of the achievements, and we need to work on the water companies about how they discharge sewage. I'm not saying that, but we also need to recognise that rivers are amazing places with lots of biodiversity, lots of things happening in them. And it would be nice to see our Burbot in there happening as well.
One can hope, can't they?
Absolutely.
Well, look, thanks for coming on, Ian.
No, it's a pleasure at all.
That was Ian Welby. So, essentially, there's no water quality reason or climate reason why we couldn't have Burbot back. Well, from one fisheries scientist to another, my next guest is Mark Everard. Mark is a keen angler and conservationist, and he literally wrote the book on Burbot. There's a link to that in the description. We have a talk about whether there could be any Burbot left in the UK, what kind of things they eat, should our fellow anglers be worried about this fish, and also why they went extinct in the first place. Here's our chat. Well, welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Hello, Jack. Good to see you again. Good to chat.
Yeah, it's a shame we're not on a riverbank. Although, to be honest, today it's looking pretty pants, isn't it, outside? It's when I spoke to Ian Welby, it was pissing it down, and now I'm speaking to you and it's pissing it down. So it must be a Burbot rain-related thing.
Yeah, I mean, we've been crying out for rain right to the end of the season, and we've got it now.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, we're not here to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about Burbot. So a nice, easy question to start with. Why did they go extinct in the UK?
Well, it's interesting. You talk to a lot of people, including some experts who tell you it's climate change, but it's actually none of the sort. What people don't realise is how diverse the genetic strains of Burbot are. And a lot of the science that's been done on burbot is where they're more prolific, which is in North America and Scandinavia, where there are a much bigger strain of fish that lives in ice lakes. And so they come in winter into the margins and they spawn. So people extrapolate that to our burbot. But our burbot, okay, they're extinct, but the DNA extracted from museum specimens matches the Western European strain, which are much smaller fish and even live in trout stream environments and live at far lower latitudes today than they ever did in the UK. So it's not really climate. You have to go back to the life cycle, and the life cycle of these small river strains is that they forge up rivers and they spawn in permanent wetlands or semi-permanent wetlands in floodplains, and the eggs drift around for a month or two, and they're hatched into larvae that drift in the plankton for a month or two, and then they turn into little benthic beasts. So without that 2-3 months of inundation in floodplains, then you stop recruiting burbot. And of course, what have we expunged completely from the British landscape, particularly since the Second World War, but really since Roman times progressively? It's exactly that habitat where once burbot were recorded as being incredibly profuse. So it's habitat at the end of the day. And I get a bit tired of people saying, oh, climate change, there's no point in doing anything. Well, it's not climate change, and there's a lot of point in doing stuff.
Yeah, I've said to all the others I've spoke to, I've never known a fish to have so much misinformation as burbot. There's so many have-a-go experts who will tell you all these things, and it's just all unsubstantiated primarily.
I mean, that's why I wrote the burbot book, Conservation of the Enigmatic Freshwater Codfish, because with the burbot reintroduction that's being led by Jonah Tosney at Norfolk Rivers Trust, there was just a need for the right information to be put together. I mean, Jonah's not, he's sort of on top of it, but to put that out in a consolidated form struck me as being really important, so that we know exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, you literally wrote the book on burbot, so that's why we've got you on here. So it's not so much a water quality thing then, or did that play a part as well to a degree?
Water quality will have played a part, because the Trent was a stronghold, and as you know, as a Nottingham boy, the Trent, well, in the 60s, I mean, the Trent was dire. I remember, reading about it as a youngster, and it once had more power stations along its length than any river, certainly in Europe, and I think the world. And its temperature was really high, and this is a cold water species, so that can't have helped, along with all the metal and the other organic pollution. But still, the burbot, if they're going to spawn in the headwaters, are probably, well, they need the right habitat, and to have any chance at all, they need that. But they were lost from rural rivers as much as urban rivers. Yeah, and that tells you something.
Yeah, Ian was saying as well about, although rivers are not great at the minute, you can't lose sight that they're still a damn sight better than they were in the 60s. They need work. I'm not saying they're brilliant, but they're of sufficient quality that if we did bring burbot back, they'd survive from a water quality perspective in rivers now.
I don't believe that burbot are particularly exacting, actually, when you look at the kind of the muddy, lagoony habitat that they used to exist in, and certainly do in continental Europe.
Yeah,
you're not talking grayling habitat here mainly.
No, it's really interesting you say that, because I brought this up with Johan, and he was saying, they're not actually that delicate. He's saying like brown trout are more delicate. If you've got brown trout in your river, then there's no reason why you couldn't have burbot in your river, or even pike to a degree. He said pike are a little bit more delicate. So it's only because, like you say, from habitat loss, but also water quality to a degree that we lost them. So there's all these other kind of factors that come into play. What do they eat? Because a lot of people might look at them and think, what do they munch on?
Well, I mean, they're piscivorous and they're carnivorous in the widest sense. I mean, one of the things that really interested me is, would the reintroduction help us address the signal crayfish invasion? And in fact, there is some research on the continent that in fact, particularly in America with signal crayfish, where the burbot numbers are high, the signal crayfish numbers are low, and conversely. And certainly in Germany, what's that goby that's
like a freshwater goby, isn't it? Is it a Caspian goby or something like that?
I off the top of my head I can't remember, but it's a round goby, the round goby.
Yeah.
It's become really invasive. But where the burbot have taken off, they seem to munch them because the gobies like that sort of hiding habitat, the burbot like. And burbot are quite sort of lazy, really. So if something goes munching into its den, it's going to snack on it. Getting our native fauna back in that sense could help us deal with some of our invasive species problems. But I mean, there is a sort of a certain fear, there always is, oh, they're piscivorous, therefore they'll eat everything. Well, I don't think they're ever going to be that profuse, to be quite honest. And, we can live with herons and egrets and kingfishers and chub and perch and trout, all of which munch fish. So adding one more to the mix is not probably going to be problematic at all.
Well, it's interesting you brought this up because you've read my mind. So obviously we're both anglers. We love our fishing. We love fishing for lots of different things. And it is one thing that I've heard from a few anglers that are there any concerns about them being predatory? But like you've just explained, all fish eat each other and mix around with each other. And if you think about in the grand scheme of things, burbot have only not been in the UK for 50, 60 years. And prior to that, since the last ice age, burbot would have coexisted with roach, with trout, with pike, with all those other things. And they continue to coexist with them in Europe. So they all kind of co-evolved and lived together. So I can't see burbot coming into our rivers and wiping them out and only having these burbot in rivers. I think that would be unrealistic.
I think it's completely unrealistic. Doesn't stop people believing it, but it is unrealistic.
No, that's the day and age we live in, unfortunately. But you would think anglers would get excited because how often do you get a new species of fish, or in this case, an old one, I suppose, introduced into lakes and rivers that we can fish for? It just doesn't happen generally, not legally anyway. So you'd think anglers, oh, this is an interesting fish that you can lure fish for, you can bait fish for, and potentially catch this weird looking cod thing in a river. Surely that's exciting to anglers.
I mean, certainly to older anglers like me, because the burbot went extinct in my lifetime. And, as a scientist and conservationist, it's always bothered me that we've let it go, under our watch. So welcoming it back, I think is important because it belongs here, but also because it's also an indicator that we've got the river systems working again, that we've butchered, frankly. None of our rivers look anything like a natural river. I mean, none of them do. We constrain the channels, we drain the landscape. Naturally, a river would be a channel with a wetland hinterlands, and they support the life stages of many, many fish species, as well as, water voles and all our native fauna and flora. But we've turned them into these regimented tubes and destroyed a lot of the habitat. I mean, imagine how rich our fish fauna would be if we had a truly living river corridor. And we've sort of not got any experimental places where we can say, well, it would be like that, because we've knackered them all.
Yeah, rather glumly. And this kind of brings me on to the last point, which I know there's some hopeful people, including Chris Yates, who often goes on about this. But do you think there still could be any out there? Is there any chance or dream that we might have a lone burbot swimming around the Cam or the Yorkshire Derwent? What do you think?
Well, I like Chris, he's a friend, and he's a dreamer and a romantic. But I do trust the eDNA surveys that have been completed, and the fact that no survey and lots and lots of surveys have done since the 1969, the last reported sighting, or confirmed case. Just no. All of the sightings that I've investigated since have either been spoofs or probably misidentifications. And certainly some of them, the Environment Agency have followed up with a survey, and there's been absolutely no evidence. It's a bit like the Loch Ness Monster. Could one monster exist in isolation? Without a viable population, it's vanishingly unlikely.
Well, I actually had the chap who supposedly seen one on the Eden. I don't know if you know that sighting, and he was a bit miffed that I kept saying they were extinct. And I just kind of politely pointed out that they were never in the Eden, or as far as I'm aware, they weren't in that catchment. So what are the chances of him discovering one in 2010 when there'd never been any records of seeing one? And we kind of left the conversation at that. Yeah, I think that is probably misidentification. And weirdly, in the same year in 2010, I think one was potentially seen on the cam. I don't know if you heard about it.
Yes, it was.
So,
or the ooze, wasn't it?
Was it the ooze? Okay. And that was
the ooze, yeah. And that was by a French angler who claims to, have caught them and seen them, and there were two of them around him and all the rest of it. But I don't know. I'm sure something would have turned up that wasn't just an unsubstantiated sighting, just a reported sighting. I mean, around about 2010, I've covered this in the book. A friend of mine on the Hampshire Avon, also a place where Burbot never existed, phoned me up, I think it was New Year's Day or something, it was after Christmas anyway, and said, "You never guess what I saw." And he was really excited and gone, and he was describing it. He's saying this fish, this dark fish with mottling was in the edge. Okay, sounds like a kelp to me. And I kind of walked up to it, and yeah, it was sort of the mottling pattern and fairly lethargic. Oh yeah, sounds like a kelp. And as I walked up, it sort of drifted lethargically and vanished in the weed. Sounds like a kelp. He said, "Yeah, it was a burbot." Oh, really? I'm not going to mention any names here in case he listens to this podcast, but well done, you spotted a kelp. Because they're elongated fish and they're lethargic and they get fungal covered and they're around in the edges when a burbot would be spawning and all the rest of it. And I've seen loads of kelps, and I kind of get the feeling that I'm certainly certain that was a Hampshire Avon sighting, and probably on the Eden, a noted salmonid river.
Probably a
something
kelp as well.
of that nature.
Yeah. I like the optimism. I think that's brilliant. I think that's good to have it. But isn't it? They have something like over 1 million eggs, so it wouldn't just be one or two burbot. There'd be a few about, wouldn't there? So, and the fact that no Environment Agency surveys or no eDNA surveys in the last 50 years have found, or no anglers even caught one, I think it's pretty safe to assume they're not here anymore.
Yeah, it's about 3 million eggs for smallish fish. They're incredibly prolific. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know it's that many. Wow.
Yeah, I mean they're in the hake family, which is part of the Gadiform, the cod-like fishes, and they're the only freshwater member, and they have this huge sort of fecundity type life strategy where virtually everything dies and every now and again something survives. But without the right habitat, I'm afraid nothing survives. It's as simple as, really.
That's it, mate. Well, look, thanks for chatting burbot as always. It's always good to clear up a few of those points about them.
Terrific. You take care.
That was Mark Everard. Always good to have a waffle with Mark. He's good value for money. And who knows, one day we might be fishing in Norfolk or the Trent, casting out a bait, ledyard, and the quiver tip could go and we could reel in a burbot. Wouldn't that be something? Maybe one day. My next and final guest is Jonah Tosney from the Norfolk Rivers Trust. He's the technical director there and is currently leading the charge to reintroduce burbot back into Britain. Burbot were found in Norfolk, and the River Wissey in North Norfolk has been identified as one of the most suitable places in the UK to start. I talked to Jonah about the plan to reintroduce them to Norfolk, why Norfolk is the best place currently, and delve into why we need burbot back in our river systems. Here's our chat. Hello, Jonah. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm very good. Thanks, Jack. Yeah, you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, buddy. I think before we start, do you just want to say who you are, who you work for, and kind of the relevance of burbot to you?
So I'm Jonah. I'm the technical director at Norfolk Rivers Trust. Been here nearly 10 years. Probably for 9 of those years, we've been talking about bringing burbot back to Norfolk, mostly with Carl Sayer from UCL in the early days. He was the one who kind of introduced it to us. And we've been working towards it for 9 years on and off, almost entirely unfunded. And it's been slow going, especially the first few years. We had a lot of obstacles and nobody was really interested in species reintroductions. But in the last probably 3 years, that's really changed, and there is a lot of interest and support, and it's really picked up pace, and it's getting really quite hopeful now.
Certainly, like with beavers, I mean, beavers are kind of the star species, aren't they? But yeah, a lot of kind of rewilding, whatever you want to call it, is gaining kind of more public interest, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. The beavers have helped us massively, I think. 10 years ago, very few people would have believed that you even could reintroduce beavers to Britain. So same with things like sea eagles and butterflies and things. So now it's something people know we can do, and it's something people know we should do. And I think because the Burbot has been there until so recently, then it's kind of an obvious one to go for, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess what a lot of people want to know is what's the plan? Put it simply, what's the plan?
The plan is we're getting close, Jack. We've spent the last few years talking to quite a few academic partners about the feasibility of actually doing it. In particular, a guy called Tom Worthington, who did his PhD on the feasibility of Burbot reintroduction, talking to people like Rewilding Britain, Natural England, the Environment Agency, and at first trying to build some sort of consensus that it's something people thought was possible and that we should do. We're never going to know whether it'll be successful or not until we actually put fish in the river.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be some unanswered questions, but we think we're as certain as we can be. So the plan is now to spend the next couple of years trying to make the habitat on the River Wissey. So the River Wissey is the target river for us. That's the one that's been identified as having the best Burbot habitat and most likely to succeed. We're planning to spend the next 2 years improving the habitat on the Wissey, just making it really messy and complex and letting it flood freely and do all the things that Burbot want and all fish species want, actually. And during that time, we're going to be working towards getting the consents to do it. So we need consent from Natural England, the Environment Agency, Seafast, Fishing Club, the landowner, and all these things. So at the same time as improving the habitat, we're going to be working towards actually importing the fish. The plan at the moment is that there's a brilliant hatchery in Belgium that I know you've visited recently.
Yeah.
Their fish are very closely genetically related to the museum samples from Britain. That's something else that Tom Worthington's shown. And they've been enormously helpful, helping us with things like how do we import them, what are the rearing conditions for Burbot, what life stage do you release them at, all that stuff. They've been fantastically helpful. So that's the ambition, to bring fish over and get them in the river in maybe 2 or 3 years' time, I think, after we've really made the most of the habitat that we possibly can to give them the best chance.
And the feasibility studies have been looking, from what I understand, they all seem very positive. Like there's not been any massive roadblocks, has there? That it should work. I say tentatively, but there's no alarms bells ringing at the moment.
Yeah, so nothing's been shown that's going to prevent them from being a success. Because because the environment's so complicated and there's so many different factors, we can't absolutely say. So there's a whole host of things to look at, like water temperature, water quality, levels of different pollutants, how far the fish can migrate up and down the river and in and out of the river, all this stuff, all these different factors. All of them look possible. It might be there's a combination of those that doesn't work, or a factor that we've missed, and we're doing our absolute best to nail that down. But everything's looking positive and possible. Yeah. And again, we're not going to know until we actually put fish in the river. There's no conclusive answer until somebody tries it.
No, of course. And I mean, that's good to know, isn't it? And I was going to ask why the Wissey and when, but you've sort of answered all that already, which is fantastic. So, if all being well, in the next 2 to 3 years, we could very well have Burbot back in Britain.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly, I do too. And I guess the $1 million question is why? Why should we care? Why should people care about the Burbot? Why bring it back?
Oh, so many reasons, Jack. If trout or salmon had disappeared entirely, people would be absolutely rushing at this. Even roach or dace or something that's a bit more well known.
Yeah, they would.
So I think for that reason alone, it's something that's disappeared from our rivers so recently. The last one was caught in 1969, I think. So there's plenty of people alive who can remember catching Burbot. For me, it's just part of the ecosystem. It's something that should be there. Like a river wouldn't be a functioning ecosystem without trout or without kingfishers or without otters or without any of its species. And for me, it's one of those building blocks that we need to put back. It's an attractive thing for anglers, hopefully. There's a little bit of concern that Burbot eat other fish, which they absolutely do, but so do all fish. Everything eats everything in there. It's like this warfare. But for me, it's part of the ecosystem and something that should be there, and in its own little way will help make our rivers healthier.
No, definitely. And certainly I guess if anglers are concerned, I'm going to talk about this to Mark as well, but they coexist with all of our fish on the continent. So it's not like they can't do it. And yeah, like you say, they're just one piece of the jigsaw for everything else. It's not like they're going to come in rivers and eat everything. Nothing like that. So it's almost like a moral obligation to bring. It was our fault we lost them, or we believe it's our fault we lost them. So it's almost fitting that we should bring them back.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, and everything in there has co-evolved with burbot. You know, they were there from the Ice Age until 30 or 40 years ago, as were the trout, as were the dace, and any other species that you want to name. They all lived together quite happily until humans really started destroying rivers in the last half century. Yeah. So yeah, they should just be part of the ecosystem. They will eat a lot of things. They'll eat young eels, they'll eat young trout, they'll eat each other, they'll eat young roach and dace. But equally, trout will eat burbot, eels will eat burbot, herons will eat burbot. It's just part of the ecosystem. So
one of the
I don't see any problems there.
No, that's just nature, isn't it? And one of the things Johan was saying they found in the continent is they're really good at eating. Is that your
Sorry,
dog?
Yeah, that's the dogs. Yeah.
No, there's been plenty of dogs on this podcast. But they said one of the great things with burbots, they seem to target a lot of the invasive species. So they found where burbot are present in the continent, numbers of topmouth gudgeon, freshwater blenny, and signal crayfish, which is relevant for the UK, will go down because they seem to hammer those. So if people are a bit unsure, that's one good reason, certainly, because they eat invasives.
I would really hope so. They certainly will eat crayfish, and there are signals in the catchment. We think the white clods, unfortunately, were lost to plague probably 12 years ago, something like that now.
Yeah.
But there's certainly signals there. We've seen in some of these kind of Fenlandy type rivers as well, like the lower end of the River Nar in particular, where there are big predator fish, the signals seem to be struggling to really expand the populations and thrive. So sorry, that's the dog again. So yeah, I hope they'll have those kind of positive impacts.
Yeah, I think so. Well, look, keep up the good work, Jonah. I think it's absolutely fantastic what you're doing, and fingers crossed we can get this fish back.
Yeah, I really hope so, Jack. We're trying really hard now, and we've got a lot of support. So I think probably for the first time for us, it's looking realistic now. Yeah.
And presumably, if people want to find out more, just go to the Norfolk Rivers Trust website.
Yes, we did a online burbot event, a webinar, and you can find that on there. That's actually got Tom Worthington talking all about the science of it. So that's really useful. Yeah, there's a bit of other stuff from us there as well.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming on, buddy.
That's right, Jack. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
That was Jonah Tosney from the Norfolk Rivers Trust. In a couple of years, burbot could very well be back after half a century into the east of England. Wouldn't that be something? So to summarise up all the points, the UK climate is absolutely within the parameters for them both to survive in the summer and to spawn in the winter. They don't need ice to spawn. While we should always monitor water quality, burbot are not particularly sensitive to it, and although rivers need some work, they're a lot better than the 60s and could support burbot right now. Burbot are predators, yes. Will they eat fish? Of course they will. Will other fish eat them? Yes, they will. Burbot have co-evolved with all of Britain's fish since the last ice age, and they currently live with all of those species in Europe right now. So adding burbot to the mix in our British rivers is not going to upset the ecosystem. And in terms of there being a lone burbot hanging on in our British rivers, while I'd love to be proven wrong, I think we have to be realistic here and accept that there are no burbot left in Britain. But with the hard work of the individuals that I've spoken to in this podcast, there may very well be in the near future. Burbot are part of our natural heritage. They've been here since the last ice age. Not only do they get rid of non-native species, but they're a missing cog in the larger wheel of our freshwater ecosystems, and surely it should be our obligation to return this fish that was lost within living memory. Well, that's enough of me waffling about burbot. If you want to check out the video that's on YouTube, there's a link in the description to that, and you can watch a smaller version of this with some pretty pictures. There's also a link to buymeacoffee.com where you can help support the podcast by chucking a couple of pennies at me. Mark Everard's book is also available if you want to learn a little bit more about burbot. I'm planning to come back full-time in November, But in between then, I'll be dropping the odd podcast like this, and also I've still got takeovers coming out as and when. Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast. This has been the Bearded Tits Podcast. I've been your host, Jack Perks, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.